In the icy embrace of Imperial Russia, where nobility dictates destiny and broken promises freeze deeper than winter itself, a woman's humiliation becomes the catalyst for a love story that defies society's coldest traditions. Have you ever wondered what happens when a woman's most cherished dream shatters before hundreds of watchful eyes? When the cathedral bells fall silent, when whispers replace wedding vows, and when a bride stands abandoned at the altar like a porcelain figurine, beautiful, fragile, and utterly alone. This is not merely a tale of heartbreak. It's a story of how the cruelest moment of Anastasia Volkova's life became the doorway to something far greater than the marriage she thought she wanted. How the aristocratic daughter of the prestigious Volkov lineage prepared to surrender her future to a man who couldn't even face her on their wedding day, instead found herself caught in the enigmatic gaze of Prince Mikhail Romanov, a widower whose own heart had been locked away in mourning for years. What whispered words could possibly have passed between them in that sacred moment of public humiliation? What force drew this reclusive royal from his self-imposed isolation straight to the side of a woman he barely knew? By what dark secrets lie behind both their broken hearts that the opulent ballrooms of St. Petersburg could never suspect? Before we continue this extraordinary journey through the golden palaces and frozen streets of Imperial Russia, take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to bring more of these captivating historical romances to life. Like this video if you believe in second chances at love, share it with someone who appreciates a tale of redemption against all odds. And save it to your favorites for those moments when you need to be reminded that sometimes our greatest heartbreaks lead us precisely where we're meant to be. St. Petersburg, Imperial Russia. Winter of 1865 snow descended upon St. Petersburg with silent determination, each flake carrying the weight of ancient stories untold. They settled on golden domes and marble facades like whispered secrets, transforming the imperial capital into a crystalline dreamscape where even the cruelest realities appeared beautiful from a distance. Before the majestic cathedral of Kazan, frost-covered carriages formed an orderly procession, their ornate wheels barely disturbing the pristine blanket of white beneath them. Liveried footmen stood motionless, their breath forming ghostly clouds in the frigid air as they cast furtive glances toward the cathedral's massive doors. Their rigid postures betrayed what their expressions carefully concealed. Something was terribly wrong within those hallowed walls. Inside, hundreds of candles illuminated the sacred space, their tremulous light dancing across polished marble and gilded fixtures. Yet, even this multitude of flames could undispel the biting cold that invaded through every crack and crevice. The stained glass windows, frosted with winter's breath, transformed the saints and martyrs depicted upon them into spectral observers of the unfolding human drama below. At the cathedral's heart stood Anastasia Volkova, the visionary magnificence of Russian aristocracy personified. Her wedding gown, a masterpiece of French craftsmanship, cascaded around her like frozen sea foam. The white silk embroidered with pearl beadwork that captured and fractured candlelight into thousands of miniature stars. The impossibly intricate lace adorning her sleeves and collar resembled delicate frost patterns, as though winter itself had decided to dress her. Her corseted waist, cinched tighter than comfort would permit, restricted her breathing to shallow, measured inhalations. The orange blossoms woven through her elaborate coiffure imported, at exorbitant expense, despite the season, trembled almost imperceptibly with each constrained breath. Her lips remained slightly parted, as though words balanced precariously on her tongue, yet remained unspoken. It wasn't fear that silenced her, it wasn't even the pervasive cold. It was something far more acute, more devastating, anticipation crystallizing into the jagged edges of realization. Every pair of eyes in the cathedral bore into her with the precision of surgeon's blades. Some gazes carried genuine sympathy, others barely concealed impatience or morbid curiosity. The ladies of the court, ensconced in midnight silks and sable furs, exchanged hurried whispers behind gloved hands. Their words, though indistinct, cut through the sacred silence like blasphemy. Gentlemen shifted uncomfortably, adjusting their tailored jackets and averting their eyes as though witnessing something too intimate for propriety. The servants moved with exaggerated care across thick Persian carpets, their footfalls deliberately muted. The air itself seemed charged with unspoken knowledge, collective secret everyone felt, but no one dared name. The elderly priest, his face a map of time's passage. Consulted his pocket watch with trembling fingers for the 5th time in as many minutes. His throat cleared with an echoing finality that drew every eye. Once more, he gazed meaningfully toward the cathedral entrance. The massive oak doors, intricately carved with biblical scenes, remained resolutely closed against the silent snowfall beyond. Anastasia swallowed painfully. The weight of her veil seemed to increase with each passing minute, and her diamond tiara pressed against her temples like a crown of thorns. Her mother, gone these 2 winters past, was not there to witness her daughter's finest hour, nor her greatest humiliation. Her brother, an officer in the Tsar's Imperial Army, fought on distant front lines, unaware that his sister stood alone in a battlefield of her own. No blood relations stood beside her. She was utterly isolated in her finery, a crystal figurine placed at the center of a room filled with spectators who had come to witness a union, but might instead bear witness to her undoing. Yet she remained standing, because this was what generations of Volkov blood demanded of her. To remain dignified in the face of catastrophe, to embody grace even as her world threatened to collapse around her. Her father's stern voice echoed in her memory. A Volkov never breaks, Anastasia. We may bend, but we remain unbroken. The murmurs throughout the cathedral grew louder, more insistent, like the mounting pressure before a storm. 2 bridesmaids, their faces pale with apprehension, leaned toward one of the groomsmen. The young nobleman, his features already drained of color, nodded stiffly before walking with leaden steps toward the sacristy. He returned moments later, his gaze fixed on the patterned floor beneath his polished boots. He approached the priest, whispered something in the old man's ear. The cleric's eyes widened, his face transforming from confusion to disbelief. The young man gave a nearly imperceptible nod before turning to face the assembled guests. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible, yet it crashed through the cathedral with devastating clarity. Mr. Borisov has left the city this morning. Time suspended itself. A collective intake of breath created a vacuum that threatened to collapse the walls around them. He has left a letter. The young man's voice cracked. He says, "Cannot marry her." The echo of those words proved more devastating than their meaning. It was unmerely scandal or humiliation that filled the sacred space. It was the sound of hundreds of lungs expelling breath simultaneously. A terrible symphony of shock and horror. Gasps punctuated the silence. Eyes lowered, lewd. Fans fluttered frantically. Anastasia remained motionless, her posture perfect, her chin lifted but her eyelids trembled. An invisible fracture had cleaved her soul in 2, though her body had not yet registered the devastation. The cathedral, minutes before a place of holy anticipation, now reeked of shame. The candles continued their innocent flickering, but their light seemed unable to touch the frozen atmosphere that had descended upon the gathering. The priest closed his prayer book with reverent slowness, as though concluding not a ceremony but a funeral. No one dared speak. The bridesmaids wept silently into lace handkerchiefs. An elderly duchess crossed herself repeatedly, scandalized beyond words. The cathedral doors remained closed, as though the outside world was too ashamed to receive them. Anastasia drew a deep breath, and for one terrible moment, believed her heart might simply cease its beating, not from sorrow, not from rage, but from something far more complex. A bewildering mixture of abandonment and fire. Something that burned without flame, something that ached without sound. Part of her longed to flee. Another part wished to collapse completely, but she did neither. She remained precisely where she stood, erect and dignified, every inch the daughter of Count Volkov. The silence had become unbearable when it happened. A faint creaking sound disrupted the stillness. Someone moved through the assembled guests, not hurriedly, but with undeniable purpose. Faces turned. Ladies raised questioning eyebrows. A name began to whisper from pew to pew like a forbidden incantation. Romanov. Prince Mikhail Romanov, widowed years ago and withdrawn from public life. The younger son of Grand Duke Sergei, man who, since the tragic death of his beloved wife, had attended no events, participated in no council meetings, appeared in no social gatherings, and yet there he was. Striding purposefully down the central aisle of the cathedral, his dark coat still bearing traces of fresh snow. His hair swept back from his forehead, revealed an expression not of pity, but of firm resolve. His steel-gray eyes never wavered, not once. They remained fixed on her Aunt Anastasia, though no one else existed in that vast cathedral. No one dared impede his progress. He reached the altar. She looked at him, uncomprehending. Her mind could form no coherent question. Prince Mikhail bowed slightly, then leaned closer. His voice was but a whisper, meant for her ears alone. Her eyes widened, her lips parted in astonishment. And then, without warning, her body yielded completely as she collapsed into his waiting arms. The ornate clock in the corridor struck 4 o'clock, its chimes muffled by the thick oriental carpets that lined the floors of the grand residence. Anastasia rose slowly from the bed, drawing around her shoulders the cashmere shawl someone had thoughtfully placed at her feet. Her legs trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the peculiar sensation of walking through someone else's life. The room she'd awakened in belonged to no past she recognized, yet somehow it held her future. She stepped cautiously into the hallway, a magnificent expanse of polished walnut and subdued grandeur. Crystal sconces cast pools of amber light at measured intervals, while stained glass windows filtered the waning afternoon sun into ghostly patterns across the floorboards. A trail of partially opened doors beckoned her forward, as though someone had deliberately created a path for her to follow through the labyrinthine manor. The silent invitation was impossible to ignore, drawing her deeper into the unknown. At the corridor's end awaited a study where firelight spilled from an open doorway. Within stood Prince Mikhail Romanov, his tall figure silhouetted against rows of leather-bound volumes as he casually perused a book with the patience of a man accustomed to waiting for inevitable moments. He remained dressed in somber colors, having shed only the formal regalia of the failed wedding ceremony. The firelight played across his features, accentuating the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the resolute line of his jaw face, sculpted by loss and hardened by solitude. His steel-gray eyes acknowledged her presence without surprise, revealing only a quiet resignation, as though her appearance merely confirmed what he had long anticipated. Anastasia remained frozen at the threshold, her body instinctively adopting the perfect posture that had been drilled into her since childhood. Despite her efforts at composure, her hands trembled slightly beneath the folds of the borrowed shawl. "Where am I?" she demanded, dispensing with pleasantries. Mikhail closed the book with deliberate care, returned it to its precise location on the shelf, and turned to face her fully. "In my home," he replied, his voice a controlled baritone that required no embellishment. "The eastern wing of the Romanov Winter Palace." The weight of those words settled around Anastasia like a heavy cloak. Not just any home, one of the most prestigious addresses in the empire, residence to a bloodline that commanded respect even from the Tsar himself. Why? The single syllable contained volumes of confusion and wounded pride. Mikhail stepped forward but maintained a respectful distance. "You lost consciousness. There was nowhere else for you to go." His bluntness carried no cruelty, only uncomfortable truth. The humiliation Anastasia had momentarily escaped in unconsciousness rushed back, lodging in her throat like a shard of ice. She dropped her gaze briefly before forcing herself to meet his eyes with renewed defiance. "I didn't need your charity," she declared, with all the dignity she could muster, though the words tasted bitter even to herself. Mikhail remained impassive, unmoved by her defensive posture. "It wasn't charity," he stated simply. "It was an obligation." She frowned, confusion momentarily displacing her indignation. "Obligation to whom?" Her voice carried a dangerous edge, like fractured crystal threatening to shatter completely. He moved toward an ornate side table, poured amber tea into a porcelain cup adorned with the Romanov crest, and placed it within her reach without pressuring her to accept it. "To your mother?" The atmosphere in the room seemed to thicken instantly. Anastasia took an involuntary step into the study, drawn by words that pierced through her armor of pride. "Your mother and mine were friends in another lifetime when you were still a child," he continued, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "She asked that if anything happened to her, I would look after you. It was a promise I never imagined I would need to fulfill." The revelation washed over her like glacial water. Not the nature of the arrangement itself, but what it implied. She had been rescued not through genuine concern, but through an ancient pact of honor. "So I'm here because you're repaying a debt?" she asked, unable to disguise the hurt beneath her accusation. Mikhail did not immediately respond, his unflinching gaze revealing something immovable in his expression. Not arrogance, not pity, but something deeper and darker, a resolve forged in personal crucibles she could not begin to understand. "I am fulfilling a promise," he finally stated. "I have no intention of imprisoning you or forcing solutions you do not desire. You may stay until you reclaim your name and standing. Afterward, you will be free to decide your own path." Anastasia regarded him skeptically, the bitter reality of her situation flooding back with painful clarity. Her family home had been sealed by order of the fiscal tribunal. The Borintsov family had spread sufficient rumors to transform her name into a curse throughout society. No relatives had come forward after her public humiliation. No servants had pledged continued loyalty. She turned toward the frost-covered window, watching snowflakes descend in their relentless dance. "I have nowhere to go," she admitted quietly, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. Mikhail nodded as though he had known this from the beginning. "Then this shall be your home until you do." She pressed her lips together, finding it somehow more difficult to accept safety than to endure loss. "And what will others say?" she challenged. "A woman who is not your wife living under your roof? Have you considered what they will insinuate?" For the first time, something fractured in his composed expression. "Since I buried my wife, I have ceased to care what they whisper." The silence that descended between them was thick as velvet. Both breathed with difficulty, surrounded by the scent of tea leaves and damp firewood. Anastasia wasn't certain whether she admired, feared, or resented this man who had swept into her life at its lowest moment. A sharp knock at the door interrupted their standoff. A young, visibly nervous servant appeared with an envelope clutched in trembling fingers. Mikhail accepted it, breaking the seal with practiced efficiency. His expression darkened perceptibly, though it never reached true anger, just a visible hardening of features already sculpted from granite. Anastasia watched him warily as he read in silence. Without a word, he strode toward the fireplace. "What does it say?" she asked, unable to contain her curiosity. Mikhail cast the letter into the flames, watching dispassionately as the paper curled and blackened. From Count Dechev. "Requests that you be sent to a convent to preserve the honor of both families." She froze, transfixed as the flames devoured the ink with hungry efficiency. Mikhail turned to face her, his voice, though controlled, carrying the unmistakable force of an unsheathed blade. "While you remain under my protection, no one will touch you." For the first time since meeting him, Anastasia couldn't determine whether she should fear this man or place her trust in his hands. Michael appeared at the doorway almost instantly, his white shirt sleeves rolled up carelessly and concern etched across his aristocratic features. His eyes found Anastasia on the floor, and something shifted in his expression, not pity, but a quiet recognition of her struggle. He crossed the distance between them with purposeful strides and knelt beside her, his hand finding the small of her back with unexpected gentleness. The warmth of his touch radiated through the fabric of her dress, steady and grounding. "Let me help you," he said, his voice low and stripped of its usual formality. When she attempted to rise, pain shot through her hip, forcing her to stifle a gasp. His grip tightened protectively around her arm, and in that moment, their eyes met, truly met perhaps for the first time since she had arrived at his household. Something unspoken passed between them, a current of understanding that made the air in the room suddenly feel charged with possibility, as if the carefully constructed walls they had built around themselves had momentarily crumbled. The following morning, Anastasia found herself drawn back to the library, ostensibly searching for an old charity program, but her fingers soon discovered the letter she had hidden between the shelves days before. The paper trembled in her hands as she unfolded it, revealing Michael's unmistakable handwriting, sharp, decisive strokes filled with raw emotion. Words leaped from the page. A loveless marriage, a life constructed from duty rather than desire, a gilded cage of matrimony. She felt as though she was trespassing into the depths of his soul, witnessing the private torment of a man who had revealed nothing of himself to the world. Her heart raced with each line until the library door burst open without warning. The stern-faced housekeeper snatched the letter from her grasp, her eyes flashing with silent accusation. "Some secrets are not yours to uncover, Miss Anastasia," she said coldly, before disappearing with the evidence of Michael's broken heart. The encounter left Anastasia shaken, haunted by glimpses into a man far more complex than the cold, distant prince she had first perceived. The epidemic arrived in St. Petersburg like a thief in the night, creeping through the snow-laden streets and slipping beneath doorways of even the grandest mansions. The servants fell ill first, followed by kitchen staff and messengers. The city withdrew into itself, parties canceled. Social calls postponed indefinitely, ornate masks and perfumed handkerchiefs becoming shields against invisible enemies. Within the Romanov estate, fear hung heavy in the air, thicker than the perpetual winter fog that shrouded the gardens. Anastasia first heard the whispers from a kitchen maid whose tears fell freely into the bread dough she kneaded. By dawn the next day, one of the youngest servants, barely 16, had succumbed to the fever. Michael ordered the boy isolated in a distant room, summoned the family physician who left hasty instructions before departing. No one enters except to change cloths and provide water. His words hung in the air like a sentence. Defiance had always been Anastasia's quiet strength. As darkness fell, she navigated the shadowy corridors carrying a tray of broth, her steps determined and her resolve unshakable. No servant attempted to stop her, perhaps out of respect, perhaps understanding that some battles cannot be won. The sick room was dim and stifling when she entered. The young boy's face flushed with fever as delirious murmurs escaped his cracked lips. She knelt beside him, dipped a cloth in cool water, and began her vigil. For 2 days and nights, she remained at his bedside, an unwavering sentinel against death's approach. She cooled his burning skin, moistened his parched lips, and whispered soothing words when tremors racked his frail body. Sleep became a distant memory. Food, an afterthought. The thought of contagion never crossed her mind. She was too consumed with witnessing this young life struggling to maintain its tenuous hold on existence. From the doorway, Michael watched her. His eyes followed her every movement, the straight line of her back despite exhaustion, the gentle firmness of her hands as they tended the sick boy, the quiet determination that had replaced the broken woman he had first welcomed into his home. This was not the delicate ornament society had described. This was a woman forged in adversity's flames. On the third night, when exhaustion made her sway upon rising, Michael entered the sick room. He carried a blanket draped over one arm and a steaming cup of tea in his hand. Without a word, he moved to the bedside, checked the boy with practiced hands, and prepared a fresh cloth for his forehead. Anastasia watched him, surprised not by his kindness, but by the natural ease with which he provided carers, though this was not beneath him, though this was simply what one human owes another. They worked in harmonious silence, their movements falling into rhythm without discussion or explanation. When the servant boy's fever finally broke, when his breathing steadied into the peaceful pattern of healing sleep, Anastasia released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Michael gently draped the blanket around her shoulders, his fingertips lingering just a moment too long, touch that conveyed more than words ever could. As they stepped into the hallway, their eyes met in the dim light of dawn. No words passed between them, but something fundamental had shifted, a bridge forming over the chasm that had separated them since her arrival. The walls they had built around themselves had begun to crumble, revealing glimpses of who they truly were beneath titles and tragedies. It was not sound, but presence that alerted Anastasia to his approach. A shift in the atmosphere, a ripple through the crowd as bodies tensed and gazes averted. Michael moved through the ballroom with deliberate restraint, each step measured yet undeniably powerful. The crowd parted before him like sea waves before a warship, their whispers falling silent as he approached, where she stood frozen under Alexei's venomous words. When he finally stood before them, the entire ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Caught in the gravity of impending collision between two of Russia's most powerful noblemen, Alexei turned slowly, offering a shallow bow that barely concealed his contempt. Michael did not speak. He didn't need to. His eyes locked onto Alexei's with unflinching intensity, a silent command that carried more authority than any shouted order. There was no rage in his expression, only absolute certainty that not another word would be permitted. For several heartbeats, the two men stood like duelists without weapons, until something in Alexei's resolve crumbled beneath Michael's unwavering gaze. With practiced politeness that couldn't disguise his defeat, Alexei murmured an empty farewell to Anastasia before retreating into the crowd, taking his wounded pride with him. Anastasia watched him disappear among the swirling silks and jewels of the aristocracy, her legs trembling beneath her gown. She turned to thank her defender. But the words died on her lips when she met Michael's eyes now, filled with something complex and unreadable. They stood facing each other, surrounded by music and dancing, yet isolated in a moment of profound connection that required no physical touch. It was Michael who broke away first, inclining his head slightly before turning and walking in the opposite direction without looking back. She watched him go, hoping that he would turn for one last glance, but he continued onward with unwavering purpose, leaving her with an inexplicable sense of loss. From that night forward, everything changed. Michael began avoiding her presence not with obvious coldness or cruelty, but with careful precision that ensured their paths rarely crossed. Meals that had once been comfortable silences, punctuated by meaningful glances, became exercises in polite detachment. His words reduced to necessary courtesies. Their accidental meetings in the hallways ceased. His eyes no longer sought hers across rooms. The silence between them, once a sanctuary of mutual understanding, hardened into an impassable wall. Anastasia found herself searching for reasons, replaying every interaction in her mind, wondering what she had done to cause this sudden retreat from their growing closeness. This unspoken rejection wounded her more deeply than society's scorn ever could. She maintained her dignity with practiced grace, fulfilling her duties and offering appropriate smiles when required. But in the solitude of night, when the grand house settled into creaking darkness, the emptiness within her became unbearable. One morning, passing the library's half-open door, she overheard Michael speaking with his sister, urgent tones, carrying enough weight to make her pause. Though she couldn't distinguish the words, their substance was clear. Concern, warning, political consequences. The pieces aligned in her mind with devastating clarity. Rumors were spreading about their closeness, placing his reputation at risk. The scandal that clung to her name like persistent shadow now threatened to tarnish even a Romanov. Yet this realization couldn't explain the way he looked through her rather than at her, as though she had become transparent. What Anastasia couldn't know was how Michael tormented himself behind closed doors. His sister's warnings echoed mercilessly in his mind. The court was ruthless, unforgiving. He had already weathered the humiliation of his first marriage, a cold arrangement with a woman who had despised him until her death. He had endured years of emptiness for honor's sake, had sworn never to trust his heart again. And yet whenever Anastasia entered a room, he remembered holding her by the piano, the vulnerability in her eyes, the unexpected strength beneath her delicate exterior. These memories terrified him because they awakened desires he thought long dead, needs he couldn't afford to acknowledge, so he chose distance as his shield, absence as his armor. Unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Anastasia took pen and paper one night, writing a letter containing just one word, "Why?" But she never delivered it, folding it carefully into a wooden keepsake box where it remained. Another unspoken question hanging between them like persistent perfume. With each passing day, the silence grew thicker, a living entity feeding on their mutual longing. One sleepless night, seeking solace, she descended to the music room where a single oil lamp cast long shadows across the polished floors. Her fingers hesitated over the piano keys before finding their purpose, playing a melody from childhood, neither joyful nor sorrowful, but filled with quiet yearning. She didn't know Michael stood listening in the hallway, drawn by the music like a man following distant lighthouse. When she finally looked up, she found him standing in the doorway, his expression unguarded for the first time in weeks. He moved toward her with slow deliberation, stopping mere inches away. Anastasia rose to meet him, her heart pounding against her ribs with such force she was certain he must hear it. Neither spoke, they didn't need to. The silence between them transformed into something electric, charged with unspoken desire. He raised his hand, fingers trembling slightly as they brushed her cheek with feather-light touch. They stood close enough to feel each other's breath, the tension between them building toward inevitable release. Their lips were about to meet when the door burst open. "I need to speak with you, now." Princess Elena's voice cut through the moment like a blade through silk. The silence that followed wasn't immediate, but gradual, heavy as fog settling over the palace grounds. Anastasia remained standing by the piano, breath still uneven, heart still racing beneath her bodice. She couldn't bring herself to turn toward Michael, and he remained equally motionless. The door closed with decisive finality, leaving the unplayed music trapped between walls like a broken promise. From that night forward, the chill between them deepened beyond mere avoidance into something far more absolute. Words ceased flowing altogether, even those brief exchanges necessary to maintain appearances. One afternoon, as pale winter light filtered through the library's frost-laced windows, Anastasia witnessed a moment never meant for her eyes. A flustered servant hurried into the reading room carrying a sealed letter, startling visibly upon seeing her seated quietly in the corner. His nervous hands fumbled with the envelope, which slipped from his grasp and fluttered to the floor between them like a fallen leaf. Before he could retrieve it, Anastasia gracefully bent down and lifted it, her eyes inadvertently catching the elaborate wax seal and exquisite handwriting. The name struck her like a physical blow. It was addressed to Michael, from a noblewoman, whose reputation as both a court beauty and political strategist was legendary. Throughout St. Petersburg, the servant's face drained of color as he begged her not to open it, his voice barely above a whisper. She returned the letter without comment, her expression carefully composed. But the damage had already been done. A seed of doubt had taken root in her heart, cold and unforgiving as the Russian winter itself. That evening, the grand windows of the mansion trembled beneath the assault of a savage snowstorm that had descended without warning, bringing with it a darkness thick enough to swallow the estate whole. Sleep eluded Anastasia, leaving her to wander the corridors like a restless ghost. Her shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders and her thoughts even more tightly wound. From the second-floor gallery, she noticed a sliver of light escaping from Michael's study. The door left slightly ajar as if in careless haste. Her footsteps slowed as she approached, and through the narrow opening she saw what her heart had already feared: the noblewoman from the letter seated across from Michael, her posture intimate and assured. He listened in silence, elbows resting heavily on his desk, his proud shoulders now curved with resignation. Though Anastasia couldn't discern their words, the tone carried clearly enough, confidential, familiar, laden with unspoken history. His expression shifted between tension and defeat, not the unyielding strength she had come to know, but something far more vulnerable, a man cornered by circumstances beyond his control. Anastasia turned away before either could notice her presence, retreating to her chambers not in panic, but with a newfound resolve that steadied her trembling hands. She moved through her room with deliberate calm, gathering only essential belongings, a few modest dresses, a small pouch of coins saved from her previous life, the wooden music box her father had given her before his death. No tears marked her face as she dressed in her darkest cloak and wrapped her hair beneath a woolen scarf. This was not an act of desperation but of dignity. The servant's staircase provided a silent path through the sleeping household, its worn wooden steps familiar beneath her feet from late-night wanderings. No one witnessed her departure as she slipped through the servant's entrance and into the raging blizzard, where stinging snow immediately lashed against her exposed skin. She crossed the frozen gardens without hesitation or backward glance, each step carrying her further from the brief sanctuary she had found and lost, until the swirling white mist swallowed her silhouette completely. Morning arrived at the Romanov estate with pallid sunlight struggling through ice-encrusted windows, illuminating the undisturbed serenity of rooms too quiet, too empty. Michael descended to the library, as was his habit, but stopped abruptly at the threshold, sensing immediately that something fundamental had changed. The door stood partially open when it should have been closed, and draped across the piano bench where no servant would dare move it, lay Anastasia's favorite scarf, its delicate embroidery catching the light like a silent accusation. In that moment, with terrible clarity, he knew she was gone. The mansion transformed overnight into nothing more than an elaborate mausoleum. Fire still burned, clocks still chimed with mechanical precision. Servants still performed their duties with impeccable timing, but the soul had departed from its elegant bones. Music no longer drifted from hidden corners. Light footsteps no longer echoed through marble hallways. Spontaneous laughter no longer brightened somber afternoons. Michael continued his official duties with mechanical efficiency, reviewing reports and signing documents with the same authoritative hand. But each word seemed to emanate from some distant part of himself that functioned purely on memory and obligation. Every shadow cast by flickering candles, every empty chair at the dining table, every silent room he passed served as a painful reminder of her absence. Yet most haunting was the knowledge that he himself had orchestrated this outcome, with deliberate cruelty, but with cowardice disguised as duty, with silence where words had been desperately needed. The household staff moved around him like ghosts, averting their eyes when he approached, their silence more damning than any criticism. Princess Elena watched her brother with increasingly troubled eyes, her initial satisfaction at Anastasia's departure transforming gradually into concern as she witnessed his spirit dimming day by day. One evening, as they reviewed estate documents together in his study, she wordlessly slid a crumpled paper across the polished mahogany desk. "I found this among her bedsheets," she admitted without preamble. Michael stared at the unfinished note, its hurried handwriting and smudged ink revealing more emotion than its sparse words. "Thank you for everything and for nothing." He read it once, then again, word embedding itself beneath his skin like a thorn that could never be removed. He left the note untouched upon his desk, another relic in a house, becoming a museum of regret. Anastasia carved out a different existence within the shelter of a humble rural cottage, hidden among silver birch trees and frozen fields. Her former nursemaid, now gray-haired and bent with age, had welcomed her without questions, offering warm embrace and simpler comforts. The modest dwelling contained no marble floors or crystal chandeliers, but provided something the palace could not: peace, honesty, and room to breathe. She learned to tend fires, prepare simple meals, and care for the small henhouse behind the cottage. On clearer days, she would sit beside the frozen stream, watching snowflakes descend in hypnotic patterns, each crystalline formation carrying memories of a voice, a gesture, an almost kiss. Despite her determination to forget, Michael occupied her thoughts with stubborn persistence. She hated him, missed him, understood him, cursed him in equal measure. Hidden in a wooden box beneath her narrow bed lay an unsent letter and his handkerchief carefully folded treasures she sometimes touched simply to confirm their existence, as if losing these tangible connections would somehow be more painful than the ache of keeping them. Word travels with surprising speed, even through winter's isolation. What began as whispered speculation in St. Petersburg's drawing rooms soon crystallized into elaborate fictions. Some claim she had been secretly banished by imperial decree. Others insisted Michael had arranged her removal to protect his family name. The noblewoman who had orchestrated the scandal, masterful in manipulation and innuendo, seized upon the Romanovs' dignified silence to press her advantage. Rumors of a potential engagement between herself and the prince began circulating through court circles. Regarded by many as inevitable, by others as politically expedient, but loyalty sometimes survives in unexpected places. A servant who had served the Romanov family for decades, a quiet man with observant eyes, had been sent to deliver correspondence to outlying estates. During one such journey through small communities along the Neva River, a familiar silhouette caught his attention. Something in her posture, the particular way she adjusted her scarf against the wind, confirmed what instinct had already recognized. That night, by candlelight, he penned a brief note without embellishment. "I have seen her. She lives, working at a rural house near the Neva, alone." He signed with only his initials before slipping it beneath Michael's office door before dawn. The Imperial Council chambers seemed to shrink as they entered, every crystal chandelier casting accusatory light upon them. Mikhail's hand gripped Anastasia's with quiet determination, her presence beside him worth more than all the titles he might forfeit today. The aristocracy's whispers cut through the air like winter wind, some faces twisted with disdain, others alight with the thrill of impending scandal. At the center stood Countess Ivanova, her crimson gown a battle flag, the fabricated letters of betrothal clutched in her gloved hands like weapons. "Prince Romanov, you dare present yourself with this woman."
Ow.
The Countess's voice dripped with venom, her smile calculated to draw blood.
Ow, when the council already recognizes our engagement?
Several councilmen nodded solemnly behind her, evidence of how deeply her machinations had taken root during their absence. But they had underestimated the man who now stood before them. No longer the dutiful prince bowing to expectation, but a man who had tasted enough emptiness to recognize the value of truth. Mikhail advanced with measured steps, his voice carrying the quiet authority that needed no volume. "I stand before you not as Prince Romanov, but as a man who refuses to perpetuate falsehood." He produced a leather folio and began methodically dismantling the Countess's deception. Forged signatures revealed under magnification. Timestamps proven impossible by his documented whereabouts. A parade of servants, their voices trembling but resolute, confirming bribes exchanged for planted rumors and stolen letterhead. The council chamber transformed into a courtroom of whispered revelations. The Countess's complexion shifting from porcelain confidence to ashen horror. When she lunged forward, desperation replacing calculation, Anastasia didn't flinch. The woman who had once hidden from aristocratic judgment now stood unwavering, her dignity a shield that needed no embellishment. "Your lineage cannot protect you from truth," she said softly, words meant only for her adversary, but somehow filling the entire chamber. In the deafening silence that followed Mikhail's evidence, Grand Duke Orlov, silver-haired and respected across generations, finally rose from his seat. "Prince Romanov has provided undeniable proof of deception, yet tradition demands consequences." His ancient eyes held something like reluctant admiration. "I propose the prince relinquish his council position for a period of reflection, not as punishment, but as acknowledgement that even justified actions have ripples." Mikhail nodded without hesitation. "I accept, with one condition." His gaze found Anastasia's, drawing strength from the quiet resilience he'd found there. "That I may build my life with the woman I choose, free from further interference." The room's atmosphere shifted like ice beginning to thaw. It's not approval, not yet, but the begrudging respect offered to those who stand unashamed in their truth. As for the Countess, she was escorted from the chamber, her name soon vanishing from social registries, another scandal buried beneath newer gossip. 3 seasons passed, the unforgiving St. Petersburg winter yielding reluctantly to spring's insistence. In their modest country home, far from imperial politics, Mikhail and Anastasia created something neither had truly known before, a sanctuary built on choice rather than obligation. The library walls held volumes chosen for love rather than impression. The gardens flourished without the rigid formality of palace landscapes. Every morning they awoke to windows framing snow-dusted pines or wildflower meadows, rather than the watchful eyes of the court. "Do you miss it?" Anastasia asked one evening, her fingers tracing patterns on his palm as they sat before the hearth. The power, the influence. Mikhail's smile held no regret as he entwined his fingers with hers. "I traded golden chains for freedom," he replied, "and found I prefer the weight of your hand in mine to the burden of a title earned through compromise." Outside their window, the first snow of winter began again, each flake a perfect, temporary masterpiece spinning toward earth. They discovered joy in unexpected simplicity, mapping constellations from their garden without cathedral spires interrupting the view, preserving summer berries without servants hovering nearby, reading aloud to each other when darkness fell early, their voices the only sound for miles. Anastasia, who had once believed herself unworthy after being abandoned at the altar, now moved through their home with quiet confidence. She had learned that true love required neither performance nor perfection, only courage and honesty. One frost-etched morning, Anastasia discovered Mikhail in the greenhouse, hands dirt-covered as he prepared a special place. "What are you planting in winter?" she asked, breath clouding in the cold. He revealed a silver birch sapling, slender but resilient. "In Russian tradition, birch represents new beginnings," he explained, taking her hands in his soil-stained ones. "My grandfather taught me that a tree planted in the harshest season will develop the strongest roots." Together they worked the frozen soil, their labored breaths mingling in the crystalline air. As they pressed the final soil around the trembling sapling, Mikhail withdrew a simple wooden box from his coat. Inside lay a ring, unlike the ostentatious royal jewels. A simple band of silver with a small, perfect diamond that captured every fragment of winter light. "I don't ask you to be my princess," he whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "That title belongs to a life I've left behind. I ask something far more precious, to be your husband, to be chosen by you each day, to grow old watching this birch reach toward heaven." Anastasia's tears fell onto their entwined hands, not from sorrow, but from the overwhelming fullness of a heart once shattered, now made whole. As she whispered yes against his lips, the afternoon sun broke through winter clouds, casting their shadows, now joined as one. Across the pristine snow, the abandoned bride and the widowed prince had found what neither court approval nor social standing could provide: a love born of choice rather than obligation, a bond forged through hardship rather than convenience, and the quiet certainty that even in St. Petersburg's harshest winter, the heart can find its eternal spring. In the distance, church bells rang, not for royalty or ceremony, but simply marking time in a world that would continue spinning regardless of imperial drama. Here, in their private sanctuary, Mikhail and Anastasia had stopped running from the past and started building a future, proving that sometimes the most powerful legacy isn't written in historical records or royal decrees, but in the sacred, ordinary moments of two souls brave enough to choose love over expectation. 5 winters later, the countryside estate that had once seemed so modest now bustled with life. Its gardens expanded, its windows glowing with warmth against the deepening twilight. 5 winters had passed since the day Mikhail and Anastasia planted their silver birch, which now stood taller than either of them, its branches dancing with frost-tipped elegance against the purple evening sky. The greenhouse where they had exchanged their vows had grown into a sprawling sanctuary of plants from across Russia, each specimen carefully catalogued in Anastasia's flowing handwriting. Through the parlor window, the silhouette of a young child could be seen, arms stretched upward toward Mikhail as he lifted her onto his shoulders. Their daughter, 3 years old, with her father's thoughtful eyes and her mother's defiant. Smiles squealed with delight as she touched the ceiling beams. Little Sophia knew nothing of imperial courts or scandal. Her world was this haven created by love rather than mandate. Her inheritance, not titles, but the freedom to become whoever she wished. Word of the former prince's unconventional life occasionally drifted back to St. Petersburg, where the imperial court continued its elaborate dance of power and pretense. Some whispered of scandals still, but others, especially the younger nobility, spoke of Mikhail Romanov with quiet admiration. His choice had planted seeds of change that no decree could have accomplished, making tiny cracks in the rigid traditions that had for centuries dictated that duty must supersede heart. Several young aristocrats had since chosen spouses for love rather than alliance, citing the Romanov precedent with nervous defiance. On rare occasions, visitors came old friends who had chosen loyalty over status. A few family members who had eventually softened. They always departed with the same observation: never had they seen two people so content in each other's presence, so at peace with the path they had chosen. The cold grandeur of Petersburg palaces seemed hollow by comparison. Even Grand Duke Orlov had visited once in his final year of life, his ancient eyes misting as he watched Anastasia and Mikhail move about their home, finishing each other's sentences, their hands finding each other's without conscious thought. As twilight deepened into evening, Anastasia stood at the window watching snowflakes begin their gentle descent. Behind her, Mikhail sat reading to their daughter, his voice rising and falling with the drama of the fairy tale. Sophia's eyes were growing heavy, but she fought sleep, determined to hear how the story would end. Anastasia smiled to herself, remembering how close her own story had come to a different ending, one of continued flight, of isolation, of a heart closed permanently against trust. The letter that had arrived that morning lay open on the table, an official palace missive bearing the imperial seal. After 5 years of exile, Mikhail was being invited to return to court. His position on the council restored should he wish to claim it. The terms were generous, the tone respectful. The new czar, it seemed, valued wisdom over rigid adherence to tradition. But watching her family now, Anastasia knew what Mikhail's answer would be. Some paths once chosen revealed themselves to be destinations rather than mere journeys. As she moved to join them by the fire, Anastasia caught her reflection in the window, glass not the frightened girl who had fled her wedding, nor the guarded woman who had first stepped into Prince Romanov's library, but someone stronger, someone who had learned that the deepest scars could become the foundation for the most profound healing. Outside, the silver birch stood tall against gathering snow, its roots deep, insecure beneath the frozen ground, much like the love that had flourished here against all odds in the harshest of seasons. We hope this story touched your heart as deeply as it touched ours in the telling. What moment moved you most? It's a confrontation in the Imperial Council? The quiet life they built together? Or perhaps the proposal beneath the winter birch? Rate this story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Tell us which country you're re-listening from and what lesson you'll take from Mikhail and Anastasia's journey. If their story of choosing authentic love over societal expectations resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for weekly stories that will stir your soul like this video to help others discover it. 2. Share with someone whose heart needs this message today. Hit the notification bell to never miss our new releases before you go. If you enjoyed this tale of redemptive love and second chances, you'll be deeply moved by our next story. Abandoned orphan discovers she said the lost heiress to a fortune she never wanted. Click the video appearing on your screen now to continue your journey with us. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the courage to walk away from what everyone else expects of you. Thank you for being part of our storytelling family.